Every single country on Earth is currently fighting a battle it didn't start. Invasive species, animals that arrive somewhere they don't belong and proceed to tear the place apart, are one of the most expensive and heartbreaking environmental crises we face. And while a lot of the most damaging invaders are small enough to hold in your hand, the scale of the destruction they leave behind is anything but small. There is one trait shared by every single animal on today's list, and it has nothing to do with size, speed, or how terrifying they look up close. The one thing every destructive invasive species in North America has in common is persistence. Once they get in, they do not leave. They keep spreading, they keep causing damage, and the communities that find themselves living alongside them end up paying for the long-term cost of controlling animals they never asked for in the first place. Today, I want to count down the 10 most destructive invasive animals currently causing damage in North America. Now, as always with a topic like this, the ranking is genuinely hard to nail down definitively because we're not just measuring one thing. We're measuring ecological disruption, economic loss, and the continued spread of each species into new landscapes. If you think anything belongs higher or lower on this list, let me know in the comments. Let's get into it. Starting at number 10, we have the brown marmorated stink bug. This one might seem underwhelming on paper compared to some of the giants further up this list, but I find it fascinating precisely because of how quietly and efficiently it does its damage. Originally from East Asia, the brown marmorated stink bug is now established across much of the United States from its original foothold on the East Coast, particularly Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey, all the way out to the Midwest and West Coast. What makes it so costly is how it moves between crops and nearby habitats, making outbreaks seem to appear suddenly and with very little warning. It causes chronic damage to commercial fruits and vegetables, requiring repeated control efforts that growers simply cannot afford to skip. The agricultural and supply chain costs across the Mid-Atlantic region alone are substantial, and because the bug keeps spreading west, the financial burden keeps widening. At number 9 is an insect that most people in the northeastern United States have come to know very well over the last decade, the spotted lanternfly. It arrived in Pennsylvania around 2014 and has since established itself across New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, West Virginia, and Connecticut. What I think is particularly interesting about the spotted lanternfly is the two-part way it causes damage. It feeds heavily on plant sap, targeting grapes, apples, hops, and ornamental trees, and in doing so, it produces a sticky waste product called honeydew that coats leaves and branches and causes sooty mold to grow on top. This effectively smothers plants and makes fruit unmarketable. But the second part of its destructive strategy is arguably the more dangerous one. It spreads with extraordinary efficiency by laying egg masses on virtually any flat surface, vehicles, outdoor furniture, shipping equipment. Human activity becomes the engine of its expansion, which is why quarantine zones and public awareness campaigns have been so central to the response. Pennsylvania's agriculture secretary has summed it up plainly. Every egg mass you scrape and destroy in early spring means 30 to 50 fewer pests come May. It sounds simple, but at scale, it matters enormously. Coming in at number 8 is the red imported fire ant. And while an ant might not strike you as a continental scale threat, the numbers in places like Texas tell a very different story. These ants are special cases among invasive species because of how many different targets they can damage simultaneously. They harm ground-nesting wildlife, they injure livestock and people, they damage electrical infrastructure, and they thrive specifically in the kinds of disturbed, human-altered landscapes that are becoming increasingly common across the warm climate states they prefer. Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, and much of the Southeast are all heavily affected. Texas A&M's AgriLife Extension has estimated the combined damage and control costs from fire ants in Texas alone at roughly $1.2 billion annually. That is just one state. Multiply that across the full southern tier of the country, and you start to understand why invasive species researchers treat fire ants as one of the most persistently expensive problems on the continent. At number 7 is the sea lamprey, and this one genuinely unsettles me every time I revisit it. The sea lamprey is a jawless, parasitic fish that colonized the Great Lakes. Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and Minnesota are all heavily affected after man-made canal construction gave it access past the natural barrier of Niagara Falls. It doesn't hunt prey in a conventional sense. Instead, it attaches to a host fish and feeds directly on its body, often killing it. The Great Lakes Fishery Commission has been running a long-term control program for decades, and it has been genuinely successful. Populations have been reduced by around 90% in most areas of the lakes. But here's what I find so striking about the sea lamprey situation. The commission itself is very clear that if control efforts were paused, lamprey populations would rebound and host fish. Populations would collapse within months, not years, months. That means the entire program has to run continuously and indefinitely, with funding that is, as the commission notes, frequently questioned by by officials. It is one of the clearest examples anywhere of an invasive species that we will never stop managing, only suppress. Number 6 is the nutria, a large semi-aquatic rodent that looks deceptively harmless and is anything but. Nutria were introduced to Louisiana through the fur trade, and when demand for their pelts collapsed, established feral populations spread through the coastal marshes of Louisiana, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, with no economic reason to control them anymore. What makes nutria so ecologically devastating is not just what they eat, but how they eat it. They consume wetland vegetation down to the roots, which destroys the structural integrity of the marsh entirely. When the plants that hold marsh soils together are gone, erosion accelerates beyond the point of natural recovery, and open water replaces what was once a productive coastal habitat. Louisiana's Wildlife Agency runs a dedicated coast-wide nutria control program for exactly this reason, describing it as essential to preventing the destruction of the state's coastal marshlands. The loss of those marshlands has consequences that go far beyond wildlife. Wetlands buffer storms, filter water, and support fisheries, and the nutria is quietly dismantling them. We're now at number 5, and this is where the list reaches an animal most people would immediately recognize as dangerous: the Burmese python. Burmese pythons are, in terms of geographic range, still largely confined to South Florida and the Everglades region. But that relatively small footprint should not mislead anyone about the depth of the damage being done there. Florida's own wildlife agency describes them as extremely invasive due to their impacts on native wildlife, and the state has made it legal to remove them year-round on many managed lands, with continuous removal actively encouraged. These are apex predators in an ecosystem that has no evolutionary history with them, and they eat indiscriminately: mammals, birds, reptiles, all of it. Removing the population is not considered a realistic goal. Suppression is. That is the honest state of play with Burmese pythons in Florida, and it is not a situation that is going to resolve itself. At number 4 is the emerald ash borer, and this is perhaps the most underappreciated entry on this list. This small metallic green beetle arrived from Asia, most likely in shipping materials, and was first detected near Detroit, Michigan in 2002. Since then, it has spread to Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, Pennsylvania, and well beyond, with its range now reaching Oregon on the west coast. The emerald ash borer kills ash trees by tunneling through the inner bark as larvae, cutting off the tree's ability to transport water and nutrients. Minnesota's Department of Natural Resources has stated that the beetle has already killed millions of ash trees across the United States and Canada. What makes this particularly costly beyond the loss of the trees themselves is the secondary consequence. Dead and dying trees near roads, homes, and power lines become hazards that require expensive removal. Communities end up paying to take down trees they didn't want to lose in the first place. Oregon's Forestry Department has described the state's ash trees as essentially sitting ducks, and every western state facing this pest for the first time knows it is already running behind. Number 3 is bighead and silver carp, and the scale of this problem is almost difficult to comprehend. These fish were imported in the 1970s to control algae and parasites in aquaculture facilities across the southern United States. They escaped during flood events and have been moving northward through the Mississippi River Basin ever since, now found throughout Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Indiana, and Ohio. As filter feeders that can consume between 5 and 20% of their body weight daily in plankton, the base of any freshwater food web, they can fundamentally change what a river system is capable of supporting once they reach high numbers. Kentucky's Wildlife Agency increased payments to commercial fishers specifically to keep harvest pressure high, and their approach is worth quoting directly. The goal is to keep suppressing populations in the lakes where management strategy is showing results. More than 15 million pounds of these fish were harvested from Kentucky and Barkley Lakes alone in 2024, and more than 74 million pounds have been removed from those lakes since 2013, and they are still there. That number should tell you everything about the persistence problem. Sitting at number 2 is something that might surprise you: zebra and quagga mussels. These small freshwater shellfish, native to Eastern Europe, arrived in the Great Lakes in the late 1980s, almost certainly via ballast water from cargo ships. They have since spread to Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, New York, Nevada, Arizona, California, Colorado, and Utah. The reason they rank this high is the sheer breadth of what they affect. They clog water intake pipes for cities, power plants, and irrigation systems. They encrust boats, docks, and any submerged infrastructure. They strip plankton from waterways in such quantities that they shift the food baselines native fish depend on. Oregon's invasive species coordinator, Rick Boatner, put it as plainly as anyone could: once quagga mussels arrive, they will forever change how a state uses its water. That's not hyperbole. It's a practical description of infrastructure management in a world with invasive mussels. They are in dozens of states, and there is no cost-effective way to remove them from a large body of water once they're established. And at number 1, we have feral swine, and honestly, this placement is hard to argue with once you look at the full picture. Wild pigs are present in at least 35 states, with the heaviest concentrations in Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the broader Southeast, as well as California and Hawaii. Their primary form of destruction is rooting, a term that sounds almost pastoral until you see what it actually means. Their excavation of soil turns native plant communities into bare earth, collapses ground nests, muddies vital waterways, makes it trivially easy for invasive weeds to take hold, and causes immediate, visible damage to agricultural land the moment a sounder moves through. Annual U.S. agricultural losses from feral swine are commonly cited at over $1.6 billion, and that figure doesn't even attempt to capture the full ecological cost, including erosion, water quality degradation, and habitat loss. The USDA has long described feral swine as a fast-growing population that expands its range rapidly without sustained pressure, and what makes them so maddeningly difficult to control is their resilience. Remove the pressure, and they bounce back fast. They are intelligent, adaptable, omnivorous, and extraordinarily prolific. Managing them is not a project with an end date, it is a permanent commitment.